Hi everybody, my name is Justin Barker. I'm the Global Director of Strategy for Streaming for PIAS, which is a large independent label group that looks after both signed artists, distributed artists, and we have a separate division which is a sort of a collaborative thing with a small subset of labels.
Hello everyone, I'm Jason Reed from Domino, based out of London. So we're an independent label of over 20 years heritage, so home to many kind of Anglo-American acts such as Arctic Monkeys, Hot Chip, and the like. And yeah, obviously being head digital at a record label is pretty varied, but my main kind of thrust of my day-to-day is working with the digital services, whether that's Spotify and Apple. And yeah, my role at Domino is global as well, so we have offices in New York and across Europe too.
Hi everyone, my name's Sam Lee. I run Songular Music, which is a company that I set up to help the most exciting new upcoming artists make the most of streaming through playlists. I guess, to put it simply, I'm a streaming playlist plugger.
Okay. So for the guys that have been here all day, right at the start of the day, I put a few facts and figures in front of you about streaming numbers. So I'm just going to reiterate those just to get us kicked off today. So in 2016, we had 15.1, this is just for the first quarter of 2016, we had 15.1 billion streams. So huge numbers that we're talking about now compared to previous years. And Spotify in the UK is now reported to be at around 10 million
it's about 10
users, yeah. So how, in your respective companies, what would you say the general feeling is towards streaming at the minute? In previous years, it's always been a bit like, oh, where's my money going? All these kind of questions. How is it nowadays?
I mean, I would say that the thing that I observed the most about this is going back to when I was at Universal Music and Spotify first came in with an entourage, small entourage, with this product that was still in a private beta outside of the Nordics, and they were looking to expand. And they showed some really encouraging signs of growth. And we sat in this meeting with our whole digital teams across all of our labels and our commercial division, so our sales guys. And I remember at the time, like I was working in that digital team, and it was a very sort of cutting-edge, like R&D team that looked at exciting new digital products and services, evaluated them, incubated them, and constantly looking at that in a very difficult time because the money from digital just wasn't there. We were being destroyed by piracy on all sides. We couldn't see how people were going to, like this new generation that had been bred on your Napsters and your Kazars and Morpheuses and, you know, P2P stuff, were ever going to pay for music again. So when this company came in, also the legal alternative was very restrictive back then. There was a lot of DRM around downloads, like not full catalogs on downloads, and as a consumer, it was a really poor experience, the legal things. So when Spotify first came in, they showed us this fantastic product that looked very similar in its UI to iTunes, so it's very intuitive for all of us to use. And it came with a model of revenue that actually made some sense if you could scale it, and that was really where the doubt was in our mind. But on the other hand, you had all these sales guys who were like, oh my God, this is gonna absolutely kill our business. No one's ever going to buy music again with this thing. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because, like, at the time, it was seen very much as a disruptor for retail, right? So Spotify was treated like any other DSP, like iTunes, and for a long time, it was very much managed like that, the relationships with them. But actually, as it's emerged, and actually as Spotify themselves have always stated, it's just as much, if not a lot more, of a disruptor for radio. So I think, like, and that means you have a lot of very casual fans using the same platform as very hardcore users. And that's never really happened before. So you would have had a lot of people, the majority, who maybe bought one album a year. I think in the UK the average is 2, and that's one of the highest in the world. If they bought anything at all, most people just happy with the radio. And now they use Spotify, and that's created a far more frictionless environment where there is a lot lower barriers to entry to this platform. And that's why you started to scale this base. And that's important, that word scale, because that's how everyone gets paid on these platforms. That's a volume-driven business. Like, you're talking about very small margins at colossal volume, which is actually the opposite of what it was in the CD and downloads era, where it was a relatively small audience at a high margin. So that's really what's brought in all of the the extra money, I think, as the platform scales, and that's been very exciting to see. And I think it's really in the last couple of years that the entire industry has really started to reap the benefits of that.
I think it's quite interesting. I used to work at a streaming service called Deezer in the UK, where I was the editor there. And you can almost pinpoint, I think, the moment where the industry started sitting up and going, okay, this is a serious thing. And it was when streaming was included in the charts. It was like overnight, the conversations went from, is streaming killing the music industry, to which the answer in the articles and think pieces that sprung up about that was usually yes. To as soon as it was included in the charts, everybody came on board. And I think it was really noticeable for us, dealing with labels, dealing with distributors, that change. Like I said, it was overnight. It was really, that was quite a pivotal moment for sure, I think.
I can give the other side of that as well, from the label side, because I totally agree with you, and these two things happened at pretty much the same time. But I remember the point where I was called into my boss's office, and he said, that playlist making stuff that you're doing that I didn't really, I could have let you do to see how you got on with. Well, yeah, you're now going to be doing that full time. And that was at the end of 2013 into 2014. And the reason for that was that's the quarter that the bottom just fell out of the downloads market at that label. And they were like, oh my God, we really have to take this streaming shit seriously now.
I mean, I think there's been, a real kind of change in public perception about the idea of paying for music subscriptions. So I think, the market stats from the beginning of this year said that, the revenue coming from paid subscriptions in the UK was up 2/3. And so, that kind of sense of scale making sense, across the board, regardless of genre really, has, been very noticeable. And so, as you say, I've worked at labels for the past 7 or 8 years, and, at that point, back then it was very much like stream was a complete no-go, and it's just, very suddenly, I think over a couple of years now become front and center really of what we're doing in terms of, the first thing we're talking about around most campaigns.
And also the other thing that's really important, again, but going to that volume issue, is just how much streaming has opened up your global markets. Like markets that were never going to buy your stuff, they probably even stock it. Like, Spotify's second biggest territory globally right now is Brazil, right? We weren't selling records in Brazil in any kind of volume for the last ever, I think, right? And now if you look at most of independent artists, a lot of the time, the top in their about tabs, amongst their top 5 cities are Sao Paulo, Rio, Mexico City. Mexico's the 4th biggest market for Spotify, and all of these places that you just never monetized that audience before. So it's a huge amount of extra cash coming in.
And that is a really interesting point on a lot of levels. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day about how the analytics that you can find around streaming and around general digital activities of artists providing a tunnel into sort of cultures and spaces that you've never really been able to access before. So that links very closely to what you just said about the Brazilian Spotify figures. I think South America generally is a crazy, crazy streaming market.
It's an extremely populous country.
Yeah.
And you're monetizing based on time now rather than against money. It's have you got the time to listen to this stuff? You're going to get paid on these streams after 30 seconds. So the more you can find people to do that, especially to do it multiple times, you're going to expand your potential audience hugely.
Yeah. Absolutely, but back to the UK market rather than our little sunny foray there. So we talked earlier very briefly when I did a presentation earlier just about some of the key players. So can you guys just perhaps mention, obviously Spotify is a huge one, but could you just tell us about some of the other players that you think are quite interesting in the UK market or that are doing cool things or that you expect to be making good steps in the future?
I would say that, Spotify's clear market leader. Apple Music is, if we're talking about audio subscription services, let's make that caveat here, because we could take YouTube to one side, because I think it is a separate entity. And Apple Music has about, I'm not sure how public these figures are, but not that much of the percentage of the total audience that Spotify does. There. That doesn't really answer anything, does it? But it's not as big as Spotify in the UK in a significant way, but it is growing. It's not an insignificant platform, and it is a premium only platform as well, which means that often the payouts are better. And take that their stance and the way that they've laid out the product is a little bit different to Spotify. It is a bit more friendly for like albums, which is I mean, we haven't got to that, I'm sure, but that sort of format evolution that's really been wrought by streaming has been from albums and songs to playlists. And whilst playlists are very important on Apple Music too, as they are on every streaming service, like there seems to have been a decision at Apple Music, maybe it's a differentiator to also push this like more traditional format.
I think, yeah, Beats One, obviously their radio station, there's no sort of public listener figures out there about that platform, and there's sort of, there's rumours and all sorts, but I think what we're seeing is that it has a really kind of strong editorial voice, being led out of the US, but it impacts our numbers we see in the UK and other markets where, if you've got a new single that's getting heavy rotation on that station, it's really influencing streaming within Apple Music itself, so it's sort of used as a bit of a kind of tastemaker, I think, in that sense, and we're seeing actually the new artists that have been supported for us via Apple Music have a slightly different slant to Spotify as well, which is kind of hard to articulate, but certainly, it's very young lead and it's very, there is an electronic slant to it, which obviously Spotify does well as well, but it's not necessarily like EDM, it's more kind of like slightly cooler, maybe slightly left of center electronic music in some ways. And yeah, one of the, I think the key drivers of Apple Music in the UK has been their partnership with EE. So, it's not a new concept, the idea of getting a music streaming service bundled with a mobile phone contract. But for some reason, I think because EE have been fairly kind of aggressive in terms of, aggressive and helpful though, I think in terms of explaining like what Apple Music is and, training people up in their stores and making it very front and center of what they're doing. So that's been a nice kind of shop window, and obviously Apple is a brand that has huge loyalty across the UK.
I think the other one to watch, I mean, it's very early days for this yet, but it's really what Amazon do in this market. Because, I mean, first of all, Amazon's influx into this market is very hardware driven. So it's really off the success of their Echo speakers and their Alexa digital assistant. But, globally now, there's over 20 million of those sold. So, I mean, that's a huge install base where the experience is much better if you have like the Amazon service, like it responds to more keywords, you can be a bit more vague about what you're saying. And it's brought in people like my mum, who would never have really done a streaming service, but loves her Alexa speaker when she's like in the kitchen and like has her hands full with something else, and she can just say to Alexa, "Oh, Alexa, play the Rolling Stones," or whatever. So, and Amazon has a huge, huge database of people to push this to, and huge information about all those people. And the way that their product approach has been completely different to Spotify and Apple Music, which have really gone after the youth market. And Amazon's approach has really more been to look at that more casual, possibly older market. And a lot of their editorial is increasingly steered towards that direction, particularly what you see on like as the music offering you get as part of Prime. And that's going to be very interesting to see how it evolves, both from a consumer point of view and from an interaction point of view, because at a point at which you haven't got a visual prompt and you're talking to a speaker, you really have to, all of us as marketeers, as anyone working in the industry, really has to think about like what questions people are going to ask this thing in a moment when they just have a speaker in front of them.
I think the thing that kind of excites me the most about the different platforms and where it's going and where it's at the moment is the stuff that goes beyond playlists. So I think things like Apple's Up Next campaigns, where they're taking it away from just the platform, just the product, and taking it into the real world, so to speak. So you have, the artists appearing on James Corden's show in the States, and they put up big billboards in the artist's hometown and do a documentary about them and things like this. And Spotify's Who We Be playlist, where they've turned that into a brand and they're doing a live show with some of the artists that they've featured on over the past few years. I think that is going to be really interesting to see over the next year or so, how the different platforms differentiate themselves using this extra stuff that actually goes and impacts real life people rather than, just kind of serving the industry. That's what I'm quite excited to keep an eye on.
Yeah. So we've had a bit of a chat there about how the services are operating at the minute, and some good insights into what they're focusing on and what might be coming up next and everything. But as an artist trying to get onto a streaming service in the UK, perhaps Sam, you could chat us a little bit through what you do with Songular and just about how that pitching process works from your side.
Yeah, sure. So the reason I set up Songular was when I was at Deezer, I felt like there were a lot of artists that were falling through the cracks a little bit when it came to being promoted properly on streaming. And there are a lot of people who didn't fully understand how to engage with the streaming services, understandably so. So the way it works with me is I tend to work with management companies or labels or artists directly, in the same way as a traditional radio plugger would, I suppose, and I have direct conversations with the editors who are making the playlists at streaming services, mainly in the UK and also in some European territories as well. And I think, the key thing about streaming is that the amount of data that people have access to now means that it's very difficult, if not impossible, and entirely pointless to try bullshitting people when it comes to the artists that you're working with. I could sit there with Spotify and tell them, this is fantastic, people love it, it's going brilliantly, and if they look at their data and see, well, it's not, I've wasted my breath and probably an afternoon and maybe a lunch. So I think that's kind of the crucial thing, is that it's how well the songs are performing. That's what it all comes down to. I know that sounds super unhelpful, but if the songs perform well in the playlists, bottom line, that you're in with a pretty good shout of it being supported. That said, I do think that although streaming is a super beneficial first step for a lot of artists, because like Justin mentioned, the barrier to entry is a bit lower. There's a lot of various avenues that artists can be supported in. I think that some people get a little bit blinkered by it, and they tend to just focus on streaming. And despite the fact that I work with artists on streaming and playlists, I think it's important for people to remember that there's a lot more out there as well that all feeds back into it. Streaming doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's only so long the editors at streaming services are going to support tracks if A, they're not really connecting that well with the audience, or people aren't genuinely engaging with them, or B, there's not a compelling story happening elsewhere that gives them a reason to support it. That you can start off with goodwill from editors, and a lot of times if they really love a track, no matter what else is going on, they will support it because they're just a bunch of people that genuinely love music. But there's only so long that will last if they feel like a track's being propped up by playlists, I suppose. So I think it's just important for people to bear in mind and have a plan beyond what they do when they release a single. It's not just putting a single up, getting new music Friday, let's buy a bottle of champagne and take the rest of the year off, unfortunately. It's there has to be things in place beyond that, and you have to be prepared to be looking at everything else that feeds back into this machine, I suppose, in order to build that story around it, and then hope that the track performs well. Yeah. Because that's what it comes down to at the end of the day.
I think that's been a bit of a recurring theme actually for some of the other panels that I've seen today, because I think it was James on the PR panel was saying how when he's taking tracks to like even blogs and stuff, it doesn't work on a per track basis. You want to have a whole plot in place already around this, and I think that that's definitely you really, it's much better to have that, because I totally agree with you. There might be a certain amount of goodwill to a really good song, but there's a limit to that, and the point at which it sort of tails off and there's nothing else happening, and finding that relevance of it to the audience, it goes, and then you're screwed. And the amount of times that we talk about in these panels in the industry about storytelling and how important it is, and I mean it really is. It's not just a buzzword, but when you actually see it manifest, and the amount of artists that you see on Spotify that don't have a bio, don't have a profile picture, I have to go to, I don't know, maybe a blog wrote about them. They don't even have a bio anywhere online. I have no means of finding out who they are, anything about them. It's such a common thing. And, people connect with artists on a personal level, especially your fans. I mean, there's definitely a lot of people that will be listening completely casually because you're in a, gym playlist or something, or your focus playlist or something like that, where the artist recognition piece isn't really there. But as I was saying earlier, there's a lot of different consumer types on Spotify, and yes, a lot of them are going to be the casual types, but a lot of them are going to be massive music fans that consume loads, and they want to find more about you. And if you don't give them a means to do that, you're robbing yourself of a connection with an audience that you might have had otherwise.
I think a lot of the groundwork we're doing at Domino is sort of taking that tailored approach and thinking, having very realistic targets from the start of the campaign, really. And like you say, not just targeting New Music Friday, but, actually understanding whether or not an artist has a place within the playlist ecosystem. Spotify is obviously very much a democratic platform that uses data to inform its editorial choices, and which is great on many levels. But a lot of the music we're putting out actually is slightly challenging sonically. It might be quite left of centre, and so naturally the data will kind of speak against those kind of tracks. So that's when it kind of goes back to the idea of having your wider campaign in place and looking at ways of connecting off platform, really. Obviously, this is a streaming panel, but one of the things that we focus on as a separate piece, really, is the D2C piece. So when it comes to actually selling to bands selling to fans directly online via our own stores or via someone like Bandcamp, for instance, where there's a streaming piece that exists within Bandcamp. It's a very different audience, probably, to the people who stream on Spotify.
Yeah, I really, actually, it's a really good point, because I think that, again, to bring it back to the central point, which I think, if there's one really good takeaway from everyone, it is this. It's like, you used to have radio, you used to have retail. Now they're in the same place, right? So what that means is that in the past, if you were doing a campaign of a certain ambition, you would have taken it to your radio stations and, obviously other promotional sources as well, but let's just stick with this because it's simple, right? Radio first, gets played on the radio, therefore I'm going to get better placement in the retail stores and I'm going to sell. And radio is my means to the end of selling, right? Whereas now you're on a platform where the experience is on-demand radio, so it's quite a lot like radio, but your end product, as a record company anyway, is kind of there. That's your end product. And I think that what we need to be doing is just, probably what Jason was just sort of hinting at there is getting better at finding that next thing that that you can sort of push to after people already like your music and stream it. What other value things can we offer fans of our artists?
Yeah, I mean, the priority we're putting on our direct-to-fan relationships is because that is the one kind of piece of data you obviously own and have control of for the artist. And while Spotify have some great initiatives around fan firsts, we're able to kind of target the top listeners in the city of an artist. It still sort of remains out of our control, really, and it's something that Spotify can resource to a point. They can't do that for every campaign, and so having that direct relationship is still incredibly valuable, even if it isn't the bulk of consumption.
Yeah, and then the same applies to any kind of following you're going to build off platform on your social media, or if you run a parallel YouTube channel or something like that. Anywhere where you can have a direct means of communication with your fans, I think it's like super important. It's often ignored, actually. I mean, again, Jason's brought this up already, but the amount of times that the expectation is just like, oh, we've got a playlist strategy lined up, and that's great, that's it. Right, but you've got to have an ownership of your audience. You've got to have somewhere to put them, and somewhere where you can communicate with them, and you can tell them about stuff, and tell them about you, and that you can't. Like Spotify as a platform isn't really built for that. So you kind of got to find places where it is.
So if we're going to bring this into a very practical shape now, if we're thinking about a Swedish artist that is wanting to use streaming services to raise their profile within the UK, imagine each person that you were working with, this one person, what would be the first steps that you would tell them to put in place? What would you want them to have behind them? And how would you see the most successful campaign coming about?
I think for an artist coming from a non-homegrown artist, let's say, so for instance, a Swedish artist trying to break into the UK, the first support you often find on streaming is from the artist's home territory. It's always easier to get support for a homegrown artist for obvious reasons.
I think there are even directives on Spotify around that. I think there are even sort of directives on Spotify around the amount they want to support local stuff.
Exactly, and even just on a more casual level, if it comes down to if there's a UK artist and a Swedish artist going for the same spot in a playlist in the UK, it's always going to be the UK artist if they're at the same level. So I think trying to build up some support in the home country is really valuable, because even without having anybody on board pushing the music to streaming services, there's a lot of communication internally between the teams. So the Swedish team will be talking to the UK team, who will be talking to the French team, who will be talking to the US. You know, everybody talks and shares their success stories, and they keep an eye on stuff. You know, I guess the big example fairly recently, of the last couple of years, was the Naked track, Sexual, which started off here and then built out based purely on the fact that they saw it doing well in playlists. So if you're able to build up a bit of support in your home country, which is generally easier than elsewhere to start off with, then that's a good narrative to go elsewhere with. If you can prove that it's working at home, chances are it will work fairly well elsewhere. And I guess the good news for Swedish artists is that although the UK can be quite particular about listening to music from other countries, Sweden seems to get a free pass, which is great. So that's kind of the positive side of it, is that Swedish music exports really well to the UK. It's almost already a stamp of approval. If it comes to Sweden, people in the UK be like, oh, okay, that must be all right then.
Yeah.
But I think building up that support in Sweden first, or in the Nordics first, is really valuable. Then looking to build that out in other territories, the UK being one and elsewhere, it makes it a whole lot easier, I think.
Yeah, and just to like expand on that a little bit, even if you don't have like that local relevance to the UK yet, I think there's ways that you can find it. So like maybe you get a British artist to like feature on your track, or to remix it, or to find an angle that makes you relevant. Like when you're ready, and you know, I totally agree with Sam's point about like you really do have to have your local plot in increasingly at the moment. If you're at a level in your career where you're realistically expecting decent support from Spotify, and not everyone will be at that level, but if you're at that point, then you need to lock down support from your local market that you can then export to the next one. It will make your life so much easier. And at that point, when you're doing that, you want to think creative about like your A&R as well. Like who can I work? Who's like similar to me in that market? Who do I like in this market? Who can I get in touch with? Who can my management get in touch with? And I can work with on this to take that next step into this market, so that you're relevant now to that UK market, or whichever market you're going into.
This is observation rather than necessarily a helpful one, but the editorial that we see at Spotify and Apple is very much localized, and so you know, Spotify in particular have really built up a strong team of 6 people, I think, in London, and so it just does mean that you need that kind of hook in some ways, whether it's via your management team or via working with someone like Sam. There is that sort of barrier there in a sense, I think. I'd say outside of the kind of owned playlist at Spotify, a lot of the drivers that we do see, particularly for our artists, is very kind of traditional stuff in terms of whether it's like sync activity. So we just had a track that's been synced on FIFA, for instance, which had a real kind of global impact. You know, things like festivals as well, their own playlists that are curated around kind of live activity. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not necessarily an easy answer, but it's about kind of doing that groundwork and being mindful of that, I think.
Exactly, and just integrating your streaming presence into whatever your larger plan would be.
There's another really important consideration to make, though, because like only certain playlists are curated by the UK team, right? And that's not immediately obvious anymore, because you know they sort of migrated all of their playlists into a central Spotify account, so it's not so easy to see which territory looks after which playlists. But if you, in the UK at least, if you go to the Spotify UK profile and you just look at the ones that they're following, those are like the majority of the playlists that they curate. So I'd say the first step is, if you're expecting playlist support from Spotify beyond just new music playlists, look at the ones they curate, and ask yourself, does my music fit in any of these playlists? Is it worth me going to the UK first? Because if the answer is no, then maybe you're better off looking at somewhere else first to help build that plot. Like, for example, like we get like so many pitching requests, even for our internal playlists, from like metal labels. And I'm like, yep, Spotify UK does not curate metal playlists. We can't help you. But I still get 20 emails a day from the same PR. Thanks, guys.
I think we've got about, I'm really not sure, I think we've got about 10 minutes left. So does anybody have any questions in the audience?
But what's the market share of streaming in UK? It's kind of 85% in Sweden. of which Spotify has, I guess, more than 90%. What's the shares in UK at the moment of streaming versus physical versus download, etc.?
This is slightly approximate, but I think it's about a third of the market. So in terms
I'd say it's about that.
Yeah, so in terms of all revenues across physical, digital, sync, and so on, it's about a third of the market, and actually it's about to overtake physical for the first time, probably about now.
Yeah, probably.
So it's growing, and it's growing. It's more and more. Where will it be like 85%?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, we still have quite a robust physical market, but I think it's very much a demographic thing, and it's kind of, I hate to generalize, generationally, but there's certainly been some research I've seen at some local events where, there's a certain kind of over 45 bracket that's engaging with, not engaging with streaming, and very much still buying CDs. So
yeah.
I don't see that changing that quickly, I guess.
I think is what, just to build on that, like, Spotify, last time I looked at these figures was like sort of December, but I can't imagine it's really changed that much in the last sort of 10 months. The global user base of Spotify is like 80% under 35. In this country, it's a little bit different. Like, I think it's more like 60 or like high 50s, because you guys are just a maturation point of this platform that the rest of the world isn't, other than possibly some of your Nordic neighbors, is not in that place. And streaming is very technology driven, and it's a more youth focused thing. And in markets like the UK and the US, like the biggest onboarders are like 18 to 22s, like not over 35s. I mean, like when I started doing Spotify, I was under 35, and now I'm over 35, but I still use it. So like you get a little bit of like, people just growing up with it. But we're not seeing, as Jason kind of hinted at there, we're not seeing that audience yet come onto this. And that was kind of why I was talking about Amazon earlier, because that might well be where we see that audience go. And it's very much their strategy to go after that audience type as well. So you might even see like a bit of like brand loyalty going on there, depending on your age bracket.
I think, I'm not sure if it's an official figure, but there's probably about 7 or 8 million people in the UK paying for a music subscription service. And compared with something like TV, I think Sky maybe has like 12 million. So there's definitely kind of ways for this to continue to scale.
Sure, and your minimum subscription for something like Sky is going to be like 50 quid a month. So, yeah.
In Sweden, it's very possible, and we often do, release albums digital only. Albums, all releases. What are the chances doing that in UK? Do you still need the physical product? For breaking a new act, it's an investment cost that you won't get back, and you don't need the physical except for merchandise.
Yeah, I think if you're like a brand new artist, I'd cross that when you have an audience that you can sell it to. I think even like, as personally, like, and just looking at all this stuff all the time, I think, artists often want to record albums, right, a body of work, and it's important you have a body of work as well, but like the way that you release it, I think is really another thing that's fundamentally changed here. And I think if you've got an audience, like you're a big star and you can mobilize them, like, on the top end, like your Drakes or Ed Sheerans or Taylor Swift can do, or like, you come from a subculture like UK grime, which is like very much about mixtapes and that kind of stuff, and big followings, and you can push people to your stuff, then having lots of content makes sense, because it's like, this fan can stream 13 songs rather than one. But if you're a new artist with none of that, you're overloading someone, probably like a curious person. You want to have it a bit more focused and kind of build up to that point where you've got enough people interested in you to spend 40 minutes listening to your stuff exclusively on a platform where everything listens on multi-artist playlists.
I think just as a footnote to that, if you're kind of trying to break a new artist, it sort of becomes like, where do you go from once you've released the album? So, if you're looking for playlist support at Spotify, they're very much focused on the new and the ephemeral, really, and what's very current. And so, you can do that, you can build that narrative with, song after song, whereas as soon as the album comes out, that does then limit the ability to sort of repitch and to get that support at a later date.
And even for your, even the stuff that they don't actually manually curate, even for like your sort of algorithmically created playlists, like even in a simple sense, if you look at something like Release Radar, like Release Radar is like basic for, I'm sure you guys already know, but like, if you're following an artist or you're listening to a lot, or you're listening to a lot of their stuff from your collection, that's what's going to power the artists that go into your Release Radar playlist every week. But that goes back 3 weeks. Like, 3 weeks of last is what you're going to see every week in that playlist. So it even affects the frequency which you're going to release stuff. But the point is that if you're going to drop a 13-track album and you're just expecting release radar playlists, it means you're going to have one stream of that track in that period, and that's it. Whereas if you space them out like a month and month and month, you're going to get 13 each time on these release radar playlists. So like that's definitely something to consider as well, and implications for like Discover Weekly and anything else that's driven off the back of the data.
That's a really good insider tip there. That's very top knowledge. Has anybody else got any questions? Yeah.
So what correlation do you actually see between playlist placement and actual artist success? And I know there's like larger playlists, like let's say like Rap Caviar versus smaller ones. And do you always aim for the big one, or do you have to like figure out how to democratize that and have the best success for the artist?
It depends on how you're quantifying success. I think if you're quantifying success in monetary terms exclusively, then definitely. Like you can't hit like any kind of significant scale on that platform without significant support from Spotify and their bigger playlists. You just can't do it. Like you're looking at, normally the amplification between an artist's own audience and their sort of reached audience, if you like, through play is like at least 10 times what it would be otherwise. Like, and you really, there are artists that you think are at the same sort of, especially when you've been in this business a long time and you kind of know like what sort of live shows they'd be selling out. Like they'd be selling a 3,000 venue, but like when you look at them next to each other, one has support from Spotify and one doesn't, and one has 10 times the plays the other one does. So like that's the first point. But if you're quantifying success in terms of artist recognition and building your artist brand, then it gets a bit more complicated because as I kind of hinted at earlier, like a lot of the listening on Spotify is very casual, and a lot of the playlists that drive the biggest volumes of streams are lifestyle and mood-orientated playlists. But the thing is that, like, if I'm doing like a workout playlist, like, and my hands are all sweaty, I can't really pick up my phone and look at what the artist's playing. Plus, I'm probably in the middle of doing something. I don't know who the artist is anymore. Whereas if you've got your artist placement on like maybe smaller but like more targeted playlist for fans, like it's a subgenre playlist that your artist fits into, then it's much more of a lean forward experience. The audience is interested in discovering in that or in the frame of mind to discover, and you will get that recognition of who the artist is.
I'd say that one thing that we look for really is sort of a very kind of sustained build when it comes to playlists. So yeah, we've touched upon this before with New Music Friday, but it's just like sometimes if a track almost goes into these playlists too early and it's the first time people have heard it, then quite often they'll just skip because it's not recognizable to them, and then where do you really go from there? So I think for us we look actually at building up particularly new artists through some of the more kind of targeted genre specific playlists, and then hope to grow that over time really.
It's not a question, but it's we're really back to the 50s. I think it's like single-driven, like a jukebox thing.
Yep.
So the music industry is like not going forward; it's going back to the 50s now. So it's single by single, and you have to get to that jukebox, that cool jukebox.
Yeah.
You have to.
No,
be
I mean
there
it's
to get it out.
It's definitely like that at the moment. I mean, I think if I wanted to be optimistic about it, I'd say that all phases in the music industry traditionally have been cyclical, and maybe we're in still a very new phase with this. I mean, particularly in the rest of the world. I know you guys have had it for ages, but like for the rest of us, it's certainly the mainstream populations, it's really only starting to. It's quite a new thing. Like even when we look at Spotify's global audience right now, it's like 150 million-ish people, right? But there's 3.5 billion people online, right? And okay, so China and India, they're like a big portion of that, and there's no Spotify there. But Spotify is really like a European, and the Americas and Southeast Asia. That's kind of where Spotify is. It's not in Africa, it's not in India, it's not in China. And let's see how, sorry, that's a bit off topic, but like the point is it's quite new in these territories. And so people are kind of still discovering it. People aren't used to having like 30 million songs all the time, and they are relying on Spotify's editorial to do it. But I'm sure that will come to a point when you'll have more mature markets that maybe want to find other sources for that, or maybe want to go back to albums because they got it's just a cyclical thing, and people get bored of doing the same thing all the time.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up. Thank you very much for your question, and thank you to our panelists.